The moment Ilhan Omar called Dan Bongino a fascist bootlicker on live television, she made the kind of fatal mistake criminals make when they think the cop sitting across the interrogation table is stupid. She mistook his silence for submission and his calm for hesitation. And Dan Bongino, who had spent 11 years as a federal agent protecting presidents and investigating federal crimes, knew exactly how to handle that mistake. He didn't get angry. He didn't shout. He simply smiled. It wasn't a polite smile. It wasn't the kind of media-trained grin that politicians trade on Sunday talk shows. It was the cold, predatory smile of a trap snapping shut. It was the look of a man who had the receipts, who knew where the bodies were buried, and who had been waiting years for this exact moment to dig them up. The setting was the CBS Broadcast Center in Washington, D.C., for a special primetime edition of Face the Nation, Unfiltered. The network had promoted this event for weeks as the Great American Debate, a clash of ideologies centered on immigration, national security, and identity politics. They promised fireworks. They promised high drama. But backstage, the producers were nervous. They knew the chemistry between the two guests was volatile. On one side was Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. She had arrived at the studio with the air of royalty. Her entourage was a phalanx of 5 people: a communications director, a policy advisor, 2 nervous assistants, and a crisis management specialist whose presence alone should have been a red flag. They huddled around her in the green room, adjusting her talking points, fixing her hijab, and wargaming responses to potential attacks. She was confident. She had survived multiple controversies that would have ended lesser careers. She had learned that accusations of racism or Islamophobia were a get-out-of-jail-free card that worked on almost every journalist in the Beltway. She had prepared for a shouting match. She had rehearsed her indignation. On the other side was Dan Bongino. He had arrived alone. No entourage, no handlers, no crisis team. He wore a dark suit that fit with the precision of someone who used to carry a weapon under it. He sat in his green room in silence, reviewing notes on an iPad Pro. His preparation wasn't political, it was forensic. Years in the Secret Service and the NYPD had taught him that the loudest person in the room is usually the one with the most to hide. He didn't need a team to tell him what the truth was. He had the documents. He had the timelines. He had the evidence. The studio audience was packed to capacity with 200 people. The producers had tried to balance the room between conservatives, liberals, and independents. But the tension was palpable before the cameras even rolled. Security was tight, tighter than usual. Margaret Brennan, the moderator, walked onto the stage to polite applause. She took her seat between 2 chairs positioned at angles designed for conversation, though everyone in the room knew this would be combat. The chairs were 6 feet apart, close enough to create intimacy, far enough to prevent a physical altercation. Omar walked out first. She wore a burgundy hijab and a navy blazer, an outfit chosen to project authority and accessibility. She waved to her supporters in the audience, a practiced gesture of benevolence. She sat down, adjusted her microphone, and looked at the camera with the polished ease of someone who lived for the lens. 30 seconds later, Bongino walked out. The applause was noticeably louder, a rolling thunder that seemed to surprise the producers and visibly irritated Omar. He didn't wave. He didn't play to the crowd. He nodded once, a sharp, efficient movement, and sat down. He placed a leather portfolio on the table next to him. It was thick, it was organized, and it was the only thing Omar couldn't spin. The lights came up. The red on-air tally light blinked to life. 14 million people were watching. "Welcome to both of you," Margaret Brennan began, her voice professional but tense. Tonight, we are here to discuss some of the most contentious issues in American politics: immigration policy, national security, and the role of identity in— Before we start, Omar interrupted. Brennan's face twitched. Being cut off 10 seconds into her own show wasn't part of the plan. Omar turned to the camera, pivoting immediately to offense. It was her signature move: attack before you can be questioned. I just want to say that I find it deeply problematic that CBS chose to platform someone like Dan Bongino, she said, her voice rising with righteous indignation. He has spent years spreading Islamophobic conspiracy theories and attacking Muslim members of Congress without any accountability. She was warming up now, finding her rhythm. People like him represent the fascist bootlicker wing of American politics. The people who would rather attack and delegitimize elected officials than engage in substantive policy discussions. This is exactly the kind of hatred that was when it happened. Bongino didn't interrupt her with a shout. He didn't throw his hands up. He just smiled, that terrifying, calm smile. He leaned forward, looking at her not as a congressman, but as a suspect in an interrogation room. "Thank you for that," Bongino said. His voice was low, carrying a thick New York accent that sounded like concrete and steel. "I really appreciate you establishing the tone so quickly." Omar paused, thrown off by his lack of defensiveness. "Now we can talk freely," Bongino said. The emphasis on the word freely made the hair on the back of the producers' necks stand up. "Margaret," Bongino said, turning to the moderator but keeping his eyes locked on Omar. "The congresswoman just called me a fascist bootlicker on national television. I think that establishes the ground rules pretty clearly. The gloves are off." "Let's try to keep this civil," Brennan pleaded, seeing her control of the debate evaporating. "I am being civil," Bongino said. "I am responding to an insult with facts. And since the congresswoman wants to talk about substantive policy and hatred, let's start there." He reached into his jacket pocket. He didn't pull out a speech. He pulled out a phone. "You want to talk about legitimacy?" Bongino asked. "You want to talk about rhetoric? Let's talk about March 23, 2019. The room went quiet. Omar's eyes narrowed. She knew the date. Every politician has dates they wish they could erase from the calendar, and this was hers. "You were at a K-year event in Los Angeles," Bongino continued, his voice steady, methodical. "You were discussing the founding of the Council on American Islamic Relations, and you said something that revealed exactly how you view this country." He looked down at his notes, though he didn't need them. He had memorized the words. "I am quoting directly from the transcript," Bongino said. "Cair was founded after 9/11 because they recognized that some people did something and that all of us were starting to lose access to our civil liberties." Bongino looked up. He let the silence hang in the air for 3 agonizing seconds. "Some people did something." "That is how you describe the September 11th terrorist attacks," Bongino said. "The deadliest day in law enforcement history. The deadliest terrorist attack on American soil. The day the world changed. Some people did something." Omar's face tightened. She had defended this quote 100 times. She had her spin ready. "That quote was taken out of context," she snapped. "I was speaking about the loss of civil liberties that Muslims faced after—" "I have the full video," Bongino interrupted. "Would you like me to play it?" He didn't wait for her permission. He nodded to the control booth. He had arranged this beforehand. The screen behind them flickered to life. There was Omar, on stage in 2019. The clip played. The tone was dismissive, casual, almost bored. "Some people did something." Bongino let it play twice. Then he turned back to her. The smile was gone now. In its place was the cold, hard stare of a man who had worn a badge. "I was a Secret Service agent on September 11th, 2001, Bongino said. "I was in New York. I wasn't watching it on TV, Congresswoman. I was there." The audience was dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. "Some people," Bongino said, his voice trembling with suppressed rage, "were 19 al-Qaeda terrorists, carefully trained, carefully funded, carefully coordinated. They didn't just do something," he continued. "They flew commercial airliners into skyscrapers. They incinerated office workers. They forced people to jump from the 100th floor holding hands because burning to death was the only other option." He leaned in. "They killed a friend of mine." This wasn't political theater anymore. This was personal. "I went to funerals for months," Bongino said. "Months. I watched families bury empty caskets because there was nothing left to bury. I watched the greatest city on earth turned into a graveyard. And you," he pointed a finger at her, "a sitting member of the United States Congress, described it like it was a jaywalking incident, like it was a fender bender." Omar opened her mouth to interrupt, to pivot back to her talking points about civil rights, but Bongino ran right over her. "Do not," he commanded. "Do not sit there and lecture me about fascism when you can't even summon the basic human decency to respect the 3,000 Americans who were murdered that day." "You want to talk about hatred?" Bongino asked. "Hatred is looking at the ashes of the World Trade Center and shrugging your shoulders. You have no moral authority to call anyone a bootlicker," Bongino said, his voice dropping to a whisper that echoed like a scream. "Because the people you minimized, they were the heroes, and the people you protected with that vagueness, they were the monsters." The first round was over, and Omar realized, with a sinking feeling in her stomach, that she hadn't just walked into a debate. She had walked into a reckoning. The studio audience was stunned. The air had been sucked out of the room by the raw emotional weight of Bongino's opening salvo. Margaret Brennan, the moderator, looked like she wanted to intervene, to steer the ship back to safe, boring waters, but the current was too strong. The ratings were climbing. The producers were in her ear. Let him go. Omar was reeling. Her usual defense, crying racism or claiming her words were twisted, had bounced off the armor of Bongino's personal experience. You can't tell a man who was at ground zero that he doesn't understand 9/11. She tried to regain her footing. She sat up straighter, adjusting her hijab with a sharp tug. "This is typical," she said, her voice shaking slightly but gaining strength. "This is the typical Islamophobic attack that I face constantly. You focus on one phrase to demonize a Muslim woman because you cannot handle the substance of my critique on civil liberties." Bongino laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. "Oh, good," he said. "I'm glad you brought up demonizing people. Let's talk about phobias. Let's talk about your problem with Jews." You could see the realization cross her face instantly. She had walked right into another trap. She had tried to play the victim card, and Bongino had just trumped it. "Let's keep this to policy," Brennan interjected weakly. "I am discussing policy," Bongino said, not taking his eyes off Omar. "Foreign policy. Specifically, the Congresswoman's repeated, documented statements about Israel and Jewish Americans." He reached into his leather portfolio. He didn't pull out a speech. He pulled out a stack of printed tweets, laminated and enlarged. "February 10th, 2019, Bongino said, reading the date like a police officer reading a time of death. "Congresswoman, you tweeted about congressional support for Israel. And you wrote, and I quote exactly, 'It's all about the Benjamin's baby.'" He held the tweet up for the cameras. It included a musical note emoji, a flippant touch that made the words sting even more. "For those who might not know," Bongino said, turning to the audience, adopting the tone of a prosecutor educating a jury, "that is an anti-Semitic trope. It is the idea that Jews use money to control the world, to control governments, to buy influence. It is a lie that has been used to justify persecution for centuries." And it is exactly what the Congresswoman tweeted. Omar's face flushed. "I was criticizing AIPAC's lobbying influence. Lobbying is about money." "With an anti-Semitic trope," Bongino shot back. "But that wasn't your first rodeo, was it?" He flipped to the next card. 2012. You tweeted, "Israel has hypnotized the world. May Allah awaken the people and help them see the evil doings of Israel." Bongino looked up, his expression incredulous. "Hypnotized the world? That is another classic conspiracy theory, Congresswoman. The idea that Jews have some mystical, hypnotic power to control global opinion, that they are deceivers, that they are tricksters. This isn't policy criticism," Bongino said. "This is hate speech." The audience was murmuring now. These weren't obscure comments dug up from a high school yearbook. These were public statements made by a sitting member of Congress. "Let's keep going," Bongino said, relentless. "You have compared Israel, a democracy and our strongest ally in the Middle East, to Nazi Germany. You have supported the BDS movement, which advocates for the destruction of the Jewish state." He put the cards down and leaned forward, clasping his hands. "The United States House of Representatives," Bongino said slowly, "your own colleagues, from your own party, passed resolutions condemning your statements. Twice. Not Republicans attacking you, your own party, Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer. They had to pass a resolution saying that anti-Semitism is bad because you wouldn't stop tweeting it." Omar's eyes were darting around the room. "I have apologized for the hurt caused by—" "Stop," Bongino commanded. He held up a hand. "Having Jewish friends is not a defense. Apologizing because you got caught is not remorse." "Let me ask you something," he said. "If I tweeted, 'It's all about the welfare,' when discussing a social program you support, what would you call me?" Silence. "If I said, 'Somalia has hypnotized its diaspora to hate America,' what would you call me?" Still silence. "You would call me a racist," Bongino answered for her. "And you would be right. Because those would be racist statements using stereotypes to attack an entire group of people." He leaned in closer. "But when you do the same thing to Jews, you call it policy criticism. When people call you out, you call it Islamophobia. That is not criticism, Congresswoman. That is bigotry. And everyone knows it." Bongino's voice softened, but the edge remained sharp. "You came to America as a refugee. We welcomed you. Do you know who else came here as refugees in the 1940s? Jewish people, fleeing the Holocaust, fleeing genocide. They came here just like your family did. They built communities. They contributed. They became Americans. And you attack them," he said, shaking his head, using the exact same language that was used to justify their murder in Europe. The same "Jews control everything with money" garbage. The studio was completely silent. "That is not Islamophobia, Congresswoman," Bongino said. "That is accountability. Maybe the problem isn't that everyone is attacking you because of your faith. Maybe the problem is that you keep saying anti-Semitic things." He sat back in his chair, watching her. She looked small. The giant of the progressive left, the voice of the revolution, had been reduced to silence by her own words. "The House condemned you twice," Bongino reminded the audience, "but you are still here, still attacking Jews, still playing the victim. Is that leadership? He asked the room. Or is that just hate with a hashtag? Margaret Brennan was sweating. The producers had abandoned any pretense of following the script. They were witnessing a dismantling live on national television. Omar was rattled, defensive, and losing ground with every passing minute. She tried to pivot, to find safer terrain. "These attacks on my character," Omar said, her voice tight, "are designed to distract from the real issues facing everyday Americans. Health care, housing, the climate crisis." "Let's talk about the law," Bongino said, cutting her off. "Since you are a lawmaker, and since you are such a passionate advocate for immigration reform." He reached under his chair. This time, he didn't pull out a single sheet of paper. He pulled out a thick, heavy folder. It was bound with rubber bands. It looked like a case file from a federal investigation. Omar's eyes locked onto it. For the first time, genuine fear flickered across her face. "You lecture us constantly about compassion for immigrants," Bongino said, placing the folder on the table with a heavy thud. "You want open borders. You want to abolish ICE. You say our immigration system is broken." "I agree," Bongino said. "It is broken, especially when people game the system to commit fraud." "My personal life is not relevant to," Omar began, her voice rising in pitch. "You are a public official," Bongino snapped. "You lecture the country on immigration policy. Your immigration history is absolutely relevant." He opened the folder. It was filled with marriage certificates, divorce decrees, school records, and social media screenshots. "Let's walk through the timeline," Bongino said. He put on a pair of reading glasses, a deliberate move that shifted his persona from debater to investigator. 2002, he read. "You enter into a religious marriage with Ahmed Hirsi. You have 2 children with him. 2008, he continued. You separate from Hirsi. 2009, Bongino said, holding up a marriage certificate. You legally marry a man named Ahmed Noor Said Elmi. But here is where it gets interesting, Congresswoman. He pulled out another document, property records. From 2011 to 2012, while you are legally married to Elmi, you are living with Hirsi. You are photographed with Hirsi. You have another child with Hirsi. Public records show you all living at the same address. 2017, Bongino said. You file for divorce from Elmi. But in your sworn affidavit, you claim you cannot locate him. You say you haven't seen him in years. Bongino looked over his glasses at her. Where did he go, Congresswoman? Omar was gripping the arms of her chair so hard her knuckles were white. This is a disgusting smear campaign rooted in racism and— Then prove it wrong, Bongino said simply. He held up a photo. It was a grainy image from social media, recovered from a deleted account. It showed Omar and Elmi together. The allegation, Bongino said, his voice dropping to a serious, hushed tone, is that Ahmed Noor Said Elmi is your brother. The audience gasped. It was audible. This was the rumor that had swirled in conservative circles for years, but no one had ever confronted her with it directly on a stage like this. That he is your biological sibling, Bongino continued, and that you married him to commit immigration fraud, to get him entry into the United States, to get him student loans. That is a lie, Omar shouted. It has been debunked. By whom? Bongino asked calmly. By you? You haven't released a single record. You haven't shown his birth certificate. You haven't taken a DNA test. If it is debunked, show us the proof. He spread the photos out on the table. School records listing the same father. Social media posts from family members referring to him as your brother. A birth date that suspiciously matches your brother's birth date on immigration entry forms. And before you call this a conspiracy theory, Bongino said, let me remind you, immigration fraud is a federal crime. It is a felony. I investigated it when I was a federal agent. People go to prison for this. People get deported for this. So, yes or no? Bongino asked. Is Ahmed Nur Saeed Elmi your brother? I will not dignify that with an answer, she spat. That is not a no, Bongino noted. He pulled out another document. But let's give you the benefit of the doubt, he said. Let's say he isn't your brother. Let's say it was just a weird, sham marriage. You still have a problem. Tax fraud. He held up tax returns from 2014 and 2015. You filed joint tax returns with Ahmed Hirsi in 2014 and 2015, while you were legally married to Ahmed Elmi. That is a crime, Congresswoman. You cannot file married filing jointly with a man who is not your legal husband, while you are legally married to someone else. The Minnesota Campaign Finance Board investigated you, Bongino said. They found you guilty. You paid a fine, $3,269. He held up the receipt of the fine. You paid the fine, Bongino said, which is an admission of guilt. You admitted you violated the law, but you never explained why. Bongino stood up again. You came here as a refugee, he said. America gave you everything, and you potentially committed immigration fraud, the exact kind of fraud that undermines our system and makes it harder for legitimate refugees to get in. If these allegations are false, prove it. Release the birth certificates. Take the DNA test. Prove the investigators wrong. He pointed at her. But you won't. Because you can't. You want open borders. You want amnesty. But you won't answer basic questions about your own legal status. That isn't advocacy, Bongino said. That is hypocrisy. Release the records, Congresswoman, he challenged. Prove me wrong. I dare you. Ilhan Omar was visibly shaken. The allegations about her marriage, the brother theory, had been the third rail of her political career, the thing everyone whispered about in the dark corners of the internet, but no one dared touch under the bright lights of a television studio. Bongino had just touched it. He had ripped the cover off, exposed the timeline, and dared her to sue him. She shifted in her seat, her eyes darting to the moderator, pleading silently for an intervention. Can we please discuss actual policy issues? She asked, her voice tight, lacking its usual cadence of moral authority. This is a personal smear campaign designed to— Great idea, Bongino said, cutting her off with a false, terrifying enthusiasm. Let's discuss policy. Let's discuss your policy of using campaign funds like a personal ATM. He reached into his leather portfolio and pulled out a new folder. This one was labeled FEC Filings in thick black marker. Nothing scares a politician like an investigator who has actually read the fine print of their financial disclosures. It is the language of their survival, and Bongino spoke it fluently. Your current husband, Bongino said, and I specify current because the timeline gets messy, Tim Minette. He runs a political consulting firm called the E Street Group. How much has your campaign paid his firm? Bongino asked. Omar hesitated. She knew the number. Everyone in her inner circle knew the number. Campaigns hire consultants all the time, she said, retreating to the safety of generalities. It is standard practice to hire firms for digital outreach and fundraising. How much? Bongino pressed, his voice hard. That information is public record, Congresswoman. Do you want to say it, or should I? She didn't answer. She took a sip of water, her hand trembling slightly. $2.8 million, Bongino said. He let the number hang there, suspended in the silence of the studio. Your campaign has paid your husband's firm nearly $3 million. That is donor money. That is money from the small dollar donations you brag about on Twitter. Grandmothers sending you $10 from their Social Security checks. College students sending you $20 instead of buying groceries. And you funneled it right into your husband's bank account. Bongino pulled out a timeline document, arranging it on the table with the precision of a blackjack dealer. "Let's walk through this timeline," he said, "because it tells a hell of a story about public service." 2018. Tim Minott starts working as a consultant for your campaign. He is married to a woman named Dr. Beth Minott. You are married to Ahmed Hirsi, your third marriage. 2019. Dr. Beth Minott files for divorce. In the court filing, which is a public record, she alleges that her husband told her he was having an affair with you. Bongino looked up. "Your name is in the divorce filing, Congresswoman. It wasn't a rumor. It was a sworn statement." 2019. You divorce Ahmed Hirsi. 2020. You marry Tim Minott. How romantic. 2020 to 2024. His firm, the E Street Group, receives $2.8 million from your campaign. Bongino looked up from the documents, his expression one of utter disgust. "You are literally paying your husband millions of dollars with donor money," he said. "You are enriching your own household. You take money from donors, you write a check to your husband's company, and that money ends up in your joint bank account." He pulled out spreadsheets with highlighted sections. Travel expenses to his firm, $780,000. Consulting fees, $1.2 million. Media production, $650,000. Some of these consulting expenses, Bongino noted, tracing a line on the paper, are to cities where you just happen to be traveling together. Hotels, meals, flights. Funny how that works. "The FEC reviewed this," Omar shouted, finally finding a foothold. "It is legal to hire family members if they provide a bona fide service." "Legal doesn't mean ethical," Bongino shot back. "And let's talk about the Minnesota Campaign Finance Board. They didn't think everything you did was legal." He held up the documentation of the fine. $3,169. They fined you for using campaign funds for personal expenses, for using donor money to pay for travel that had nothing to do with your campaign and everything to do with your personal life. "You paid the fine," Bongino said, "which is an admission. You admitted you violated the law, but you never explained it. You just paid it and moved on, hoping the media would cover for you." Bongino leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low growl that vibrated in the microphones. "Let me translate from politician speak to English for the audience at home. You used campaign donor money for personal expenses. You paid your boyfriend, now husband, millions of dollars. You violated campaign finance law. You got caught. You paid a fine, and you are still doing it." He pulled out the most recent quarterly filing. "Even after the fine, your campaign is still funneling money to the E Street Group, $180,000 just in the last quarter, because apparently the rules don't apply to you." His voice took on a mocking tone. "You run on getting money out of politics. You attack corporate influence. You rail against corruption. You call yourself a reformer." The mockery vanished, replaced by cold anger. "But you are literally enriching yourself and your family with campaign donations. You are using donor money as a family slush fund." "That is not public service," Bongino said. "That is self-service. That is fraud dressed up in progressive politics." He sat back. "The FEC fine you paid? It was one of the largest ever for a House member at the time. Congratulations. You aren't just a hypocrite. You are an overachieving hypocrite." "You aren't fighting corruption, Congresswoman," Bongino said. "You are the corruption. You just dress it up in social justice language and hope nobody notices the bank transfer." Margaret Brennan, the moderator, looked at her watch. They were running long, but the ratings were likely astronomical. She decided to open it up to broader topics, hoping to regain some semblance of a policy debate. "Let's discuss foreign policy and national security," she said. "Perfect," Bongino said immediately. "Let's discuss the Congresswoman's unique perspective on terrorism." Omar's eyes narrowed. "If you are going to accuse me of—" "I am not accusing," Bongino said calmly. "I am quoting. Your words, your gestures, your pattern." He had that look again. The Secret Service agent who had spotted the threat in the crowd while everyone else was watching the parade. 2019. Interview about U.S. foreign policy. You were discussing your college experience. "I am reading your exact words," Bongino said, reading from a transcript. "When I was in college, I took a terrorism class. Every time the professor said Al-Qaeda or Hezbollah, he sort of like added this very complicated nuance. But the way the professor framed it, this is when victims of Western imperialism decided to do something." Bongino looked up from his notes. "But the best part wasn't what you said. It was how you said it. You made air quotes. When you said Al-Qaeda and Hezbollah, you literally made air quotes with your fingers. Like they aren't real terrorists. Like it's all just Western propaganda. Like the bombs were theoretical." He pulled out his phone and nodded to the booth. He had prepared this. The video played on the large studio screen. There was Omar in the interview, physically making air quotes with her fingers as she said the names of the world's most lethal terror groups. The audience's reaction was visceral. Gasps, angry mutters, a few people shaking their heads in disbelief. "Air quotes," Bongino repeated, his voice incredulous. "For Al-Qaeda, the organization that killed nearly 3,000 Americans on 9/11. His voice was getting harder now. The former federal agent was breaking through the debater. He wasn't just arguing points. He was defending the memory of the dead. "Al-Qaeda killed my friend," Bongino said. "They killed 343 firefighters. They killed office workers. They killed flight attendants. And you use air quotes like they are some made-up boogeyman created by the CIA." He switched the image on the screen to photos of the Beirut barracks bombing. "Hezbollah," Bongino said, "killed 241 United States Marines in Beirut. They have killed hundreds of Americans over decades. They are a designated terrorist organization by the U.S. government." "And you use air quotes," Omar tried to interrupt. "I was describing how the professor—" "No," Bongino cut her off. "You weren't just describing. You were agreeing. You said terrorism is when victims of Western imperialism decided to do something. That is not describing someone else's view. That is stating your own ideology." "You think terrorism is justified," Bongino accused. "You think it is a rational response to Western imperialism. You think we had it coming." He stood up. It was the third time he had stood, and the audience knew this was building to something significant. "Let's talk about your trip to Somalia in 2022, Bongino said. "You went back. Big news. Congresswoman returns to her homeland." Photos appeared on the screen. Omar in Somalia, addressing large crowds, being treated like a head of state. "You know what you didn't do while you were there?" Bongino asked. "You didn't meet with victims of Al-Shabaab. You didn't visit communities terrorized by that Somali terrorist group. You didn't talk about the Americans they have killed. Instead," Bongino said, "you held political rallies. You talked about Somali nationalism. And when you came back, you didn't say, 'I am grateful to be an American.' You gave a speech where you said, and I am translating directly, 'We are Somalis first, Muslims second.'" Bongino walked closer to her chair. "Not, 'I am American.' Not, I am proud to represent Minnesota. You prioritized your Somali identity and your religious identity over your American identity. He turned to address the audience. You are a sitting member of the United States Congress. You took an oath to defend the Constitution. But you identify as Somali first. You use air quotes for terrorists who kill Americans. You justify terrorism as victims of Western imperialism. He turned back to Omar. Here is what I see, what a lot of Americans see, a pattern. You minimized 9/11. Some people did something. You use air quotes for Al-Qaeda. You compare the United States to Hamas and the Taliban. You defend Qatar, a state sponsor of terrorism. And you never condemn Islamic terrorism without immediately adding, but America. His voice was rising now, passion and anger mixing into a potent cocktail. I protected presidents from terrorists, Bongino said. Real terrorists, not air quote terrorists. I have seen what they do. I have investigated their plots. I have looked at the intelligence reports. He pointed at her. And you sit in Congress, in the People's House, and minimize them. You defend them. You excuse them. His final question was delivered with intensity. Whose side are you on? The silence was absolute. Because from where I sit, looking at your statements, your votes, your pattern, it isn't America's side. Omar tried one last desperate defense, her voice shaking slightly. I love this country. I am grateful for the opportunities it has given me. Dan Bongino laughed. It wasn't a polite chuckle. It was a genuine, incredulous, "You have got to be kidding me" laugh. It was the laugh of a man watching a con artist try to sell ice to an Eskimo. You love this country, he said, still smiling, but his eyes were hard as granite. Really? Show me. Show me one time, just one, where you have defended America without immediately attacking it. Omar opened her mouth, then closed it, searching her mental archives. She scanned her memory for a speech, a tweet, a soundbite, where she had simply praised the United States without a qualification. I will wait, Bongino said, leaning back in his chair with exaggerated patience. One speech, one interview, one tweet, where you defend America, praise America, express gratitude for America, without a but or a however, or immediately pivoting to how terrible we are. The audience was silent, watching Omar struggle. There are many times when I have said, Name one, Bongino pressed. Just one. She couldn't. The silence stretched on, painful and damning. Of course you can't, Bongino said, and the mockery was gone from his voice, replaced by something colder. Because it doesn't exist. You have been in Congress for 6 years. You have done thousands of interviews. You have sent millions of tweets. And you can't name a single time you defended America without attacking it in the same breath. He pulled out his phone one more time. A compilation appeared on the screen. America was founded on genocide. We must abolish ICE. America is not the moral leader. American imperialism. Systemic oppression in America. Quote after quote. Clip after clip. All of Omar attacking, criticizing, condemning America. That is a random sample, Bongino said. I could show you hundreds more. Your entire political career is built on attacking the country that saved you. He stood up for the fourth and final time. Let me tell you a story, Bongino said. You came here as a refugee when you were 12 years old, from Somalia, from a war zone, from a country torn apart by violence where warlords controlled territories, where there was no functioning government, where people were dying of starvation. His voice was quiet but intense. America took you in. We gave you safety. We gave you food, shelter, education. You went to North Dakota State University. You got involved in politics. You became a state representative, then a congresswoman. The American dream, Bongino said, the thing that millions of people around the world pray for. He paused. Somalia has a GDP per capita of 447. America has a GDP per capita of $76,000. Somalia ranks 172nd out of 180 countries in corruption. America, for all our problems, has the rule of law. Somalia has a life expectancy of 57 years. America is 78 years. He walked toward her. You escaped that. You came here. And America gave you opportunities you would never, could never, have had in Somalia. You would never be a politician there. You would never have the freedom to criticize the government. You would never have the platform, the influence, the power you have here. His voice was rising again. And you spend every single day attacking the country that saved you. Every day, every speech, every interview. America is terrible. America is racist. America is imperialist. America is genocidal. America, America, America. Always the villain. He stopped directly in front of her chair. So, here is my question, and I want you to answer it honestly. If America is so terrible, why did you come here? Why did your family seek refuge here instead of Saudi Arabia? Or Turkey? Or any other Muslim country? Omar started to speak, but Bongino cut her off. And why do you stay? Somalia is free. You can go back. You can renounce your citizenship and return to the country you clearly prefer. But you don't. Why? The question hung in the air like an accusation. I'll tell you why, Bongino said, answering his own question. Because America gave you opportunities you would never have in Somalia. Because America has the rule of law Somalia doesn't have. Because America let a refugee become a congresswoman. Because America is actually the greatest nation on earth, and you know it. He walked back to his chair and sat down. But you can't admit it. You can't express gratitude. You can't say one positive thing about America without immediately tearing it down. Because your entire political brand is built on resentment, on grievance, on presenting yourself as a victim of the country that saved you. His final statement was delivered with quiet contempt. That isn't representation. That isn't leadership. That isn't even honest. You don't love America. You resent it. You resent that you needed it. You resent that you benefit from it. And Americans are finally seeing through it. Margaret Brennan looked at the clock on the wall. They were dangerously over time. The producers in her ear were torn between the panic of a blown schedule and the euphoria of capturing the most electrifying political television in a decade. She decided to try, one last time, to regain control of her own show. "We are nearly out of time," Brennan announced, her voice strained. "Congresswoman Omar, would you like to make a final statement?" Ilhan Omar gathered herself. She adjusted her blazer, smoothed the fabric of her hijab, and summoned every ounce of dignity she had left. She looked into the camera, ready to deliver the monologue she had rehearsed for exactly this moment. Tonight demonstrates the racism and Islamophobia that I and other Muslim members of Congress face daily, she began, her voice gaining strength. These personal attacks, these conspiracy theories, this harassment, it is designed to silence voices like mine. It is designed to stop us from fighting for justice, for equality, for... No! The word cut through the studio air like a gunshot. Dan Bongino didn't shout it. He projected it. It was the voice of command. the voice of a man who had cleared rooms and secured perimeters. "No," Bongino said again, standing up. "We are not ending with that. We are not letting you hide behind those words again." "Mr. Bongino, the format." Brennan tried to interject. "I don't care about the format," Bongino said, walking to the center of the stage. "This needs to be said. America needs to hear it." The audience was electrified. This wasn't in the script. This was raw. This was real. Bongino turned to Omar, who looked suddenly small in her chair. "You have hidden behind Islamophobia and racism for 6 years," Bongino said. "Every time someone asks you a tough question, every time someone quotes your own words back to you, every time someone demands accountability, you cry bigotry, and everyone backs off because they are afraid of the label." He walked closer to her. "Not tonight," Bongino said. "Tonight, it ends." He stood at attention, his posture rigid, his hand instinctively moving as if to place it over his heart. "I do solemnly swear," Bongino began, his voice taking on a ceremonial rhythmic quality, "that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. That I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same." He let the words hang in the air, heavy with history. "That is the oath of office," Bongino said. "I took it when I became a Secret Service agent. Every federal law enforcement officer takes it. Every member of the military takes it. And every member of Congress takes it." He looked at her, his eyes piercing. "You took that oath on January 3rd, 2019. Have you kept it?" Before she could answer, he continued, ticking off the points on his fingers, each one a hammer blow to her record. 1. You minimized the 9/11 attacks. Some people did something. The single biggest attack on America by foreign enemies in our history. That is not defending America against enemies. That is excusing them. 2. You spread anti-Semitism, attacking Jewish Americans and Israel. You trafficked in tropes about money and hypnosis. The Constitution guarantees religious freedom. That is not supporting the Constitution. That is bigotry. 3. You potentially committed immigration fraud to bring someone into this country illegally. You refused to clear your name. That is not upholding the law. That is breaking it. 4. You used campaign funds to enrich your family. You paid your husband millions. You violated FEC regulations. That is not faithful public service. That is corruption. 5. You minimized terrorism. You used air quotes for Al-Qaeda. You justified violence as a response to Western imperialism. That is not defending America. That is sympathizing with the people trying to destroy us. 6. You prioritize Somalia over America. You tell people to ask what country you are from. You show no gratitude for your refuge here. Bongino dropped his hand to his side. That is not true faith and allegiance, Congresswoman. That is divided loyalty. The silence in the studio was total. You could hear the hum of the cameras. You attack America every day, Bongino said, while enjoying all its benefits. The salary, the platform, the freedom, the security detail. That is not defending the Constitution, he said. That is exploiting it. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. Every oath you took, you broke it. Not once, repeatedly, consistently, as a pattern of behavior. You are in breach of contract with the American people. Omar sat frozen. She couldn't interrupt him. She couldn't deflect. Because he wasn't attacking her religion. He was attacking her record. He was attacking her honor. And she had no defense for that. The oath matters, Bongino said, turning to the audience. It isn't just words we mumble in January. It is a blood oath. People die for that oath. My friends died for that oath. He looked back at her. And you treated it like a suggestion. The tension in the room was unbearable. Margaret Brennan had completely lost control of the broadcast, but she knew better than to stop it now. This was the moment the entire country would be talking about in the morning. Bongino was still standing. He looked like a prosecutor delivering a closing argument in a capital murder case. So, here is what Americans want to know, Bongino said. He looked directly at Ilhan Omar. Are you an American who happens to be Somali? Or are you a Somali who happens to be in America? He let the question sit there, naked and brutal. Do you defend the Constitution against enemies? Or do you make excuses for them? Do you serve your constituents? Or do you serve yourself? Do you love this country? Or do you resent it? Omar tried to respond. Her voice was thin, shaking with a mixture of rage and fear. I have always served. Bongino cut her off for the final time. You haven't. Tonight proved it. Every question I asked you, Bongino said, pointing to the stack of evidence on the table, you dodged. Every fact I presented, you ignored. Every piece of evidence, you deflected. You called it racism. You called it Islamophobia. You blamed the moderator. You blamed me. You blamed the media. You blamed everyone except yourself. Bongino walked back to his chair. He picked up his leather portfolio. He didn't sit down. You can't defend your record, Bongino said, because it is indefensible. You can't answer the questions, he said, because the answers condemn you. You can't admit the truth, he said, because the truth is that you have broken every promise you made to the people of Minnesota and the people of the United States. He looked directly into the camera lens, addressing the millions of viewers at home. I have protected presidents, Bongino said. I have investigated terrorists. I have served this nation for decades, in the NYPD, in the Secret Service, and now in media, holding politicians accountable. And I can say with absolute certainty, Ilhan Omar is in Congress, but she is not of America. She is here physically, but she is not here in spirit. She is not one of us. She doesn't share our values. She doesn't honor her oath. She doesn't love this country. Omar sat frozen, unable to speak, unable to move. She looked like a statue of defeat. And Americans know it, Bongino continued. They feel it. They see it. They have seen it in every statement, in every vote, in every controversy. Tonight just confirmed what they already knew. The audience began to stand. First a few people in the front row, then the entire conservative section, then the independents. They were applauding. Not polite golf claps. Thunderous, sustained applause. They were applauding for the truth. They were applauding for the man who had finally said what they had all been thinking. Margaret Brennan signaled to cut the feed, but the cameras lingered. Bongino delivered his final line over the applause. You took an oath to defend America. You have spent 6 years attacking it. The oath you broke. Americans see exactly who you are. The aftermath. The clip hit social media before the debate even ended. Someone in the audience had been live streaming. By the time Bongino and Omar left the studio through different exits, Omar's security hustled her out a side door into a waiting black SUV, while Bongino walked out the front to cheers from a crowd that had gathered on the street. The video had 5 million views. By midnight, 30 million. By 48 hours, 94 million views across all platforms. The hashtag, #Barbam whose side are you on, became an instant rallying cry. Within hours, it was on T-shirts, bumper stickers, and protest signs. It became the question conservatives asked about every controversial politician. The phrase, "the oath you broke," trended on Twitter for 5 straight days. It spawned 1,000 memes. Omar's face from the debate, frozen in that moment of defeat, captioned with, "When the receipts arrive." The mainstream media tried to control the narrative. CNN ran with headlines like, "Islamophobic attack on Muslim Congresswoman." MSNBC had segments about dangerous rhetoric. The New York Times editorial board wrote a scathing piece about the normalization of hate speech. But none of it worked. Because Bongino hadn't attacked Islam, he hadn't used a slur, he hadn't raised his voice in anger, he had attacked her statements, he had attacked her actions, he had attacked her record, he had used her own words, he had cited public documents, he had asked questions she couldn't answer. Even liberal commentators had to admit, usually quietly and off the record, that Omar had been destroyed. She walked into a buzzsaw, one MSNBC producer admitted to a reporter. She thought she could do her usual routine, and Bongino just had everything. He had the receipts. The political fallout was immediate and severe. Within a week, the House Ethics Committee announced it was opening a formal investigation into Omar's campaign finance practices. Not because of the debate technically, but because the debate had put so much pressure on Democratic leadership to act that they could no longer ignore it. 3 different Democrats announced they were considering primary challenges in Minnesota's 5th District. One was a Somali-American woman who said, "She doesn't represent our community. We are grateful to be here." Polling in her district showed her approval rating dropping 23 points in 2 weeks. Her disapproval among independents jumped to 67%. Even among Democrats, she had lost ground. Democratic leadership, which had always been uncomfortable with Omar and the squad, now openly distanced themselves. When asked about the debate, Nancy Pelosi gave a terse response. "Every member is responsible for their own statements." Omar lost her seat on the Foreign Affairs Committee. The official reason was reorganization, but everyone knew it was punishment. She had become a liability. She stopped doing live television. No more CNN, no more friendly interviews. She retreated to her safe spaces, Instagram, TikTok, where she couldn't be challenged. Meanwhile, Dan Bongino became a conservative legend overnight. His podcast shot to #1. His show on Fox News saw a 340% increase in ratings. His book returned to the bestseller list. His approach became a template. Prepare thoroughly. Bring documentation. Cite specific facts. Don't get emotional. Let the evidence speak. If you're stating facts, bring receipts, became the new standard. 3 weeks after the debate, Ilhan Omar announced she would not seek re-election to any House leadership positions. She would remain in Congress, she said, but would focus on serving my constituents directly. In Washington speak, that translated to, "I have been sidelined, and I am trying to save my career." The debate had done what years of controversy hadn't. It had finally made her toxic. And it happened because Dan Bongino asked the simplest, most devastating question in American politics. And Ilhan Omar couldn't answer. The cameras in the CBS studio finally cut to black, but the reality of what had just happened was only beginning to bleed out into the world. Inside the studio, the atmosphere was suffocating. Ilhan Omar's security detail moved with aggressive urgency, forming a phalanx around her as if extracting a VIP from a hostile war zone. There were no handshakes. There were no polite goodbyes. She moved toward the side exit with her head down, refusing to look at the audience that was still buzzing with the electricity of the confrontation. Dan Bongino stood at his podium for a moment longer, collecting his papers. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He simply closed the thick leather portfolio containing the receipts, the marriage documents, the tax filings, the tweet transcripts, and walked off the stage. As he exited into the hallway, a group of production assistants stared at him in wide-eyed silence. They knew they had just witnessed a political assassination on live television. By the time Omar reached her waiting SUV, the digital levees had already broken. A young man in the third row had been live-streaming the final monologue on Periscope and TikTok. The clip, specifically the moment Bongino asked, "Are you an American who happens to be Somali, or a Somali who happens to be in America?" had already racked up 5 million views before the engine of her car started. By midnight, the numbers were defying algorithm logic. 30 million views. By the next morning, 94 million views across X, formerly Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, and TikTok. It wasn't just a viral moment. It was a cultural event. The hashtag, "Whose side are you on?" became the #1 trending topic globally, displacing celebrity gossip and sports. It became an instant litmus test. But the real story of the next 48 hours was the desperate, flailing attempt by the establishment media and the progressive squad to build a firewall against the truth, and watching that firewall incinerate in real time. CNN led their morning coverage with a chyron that read, "Bongino launches Islamophobic tirade against Congresswoman." MSNBC invited on a panel of 4 sympathetic professors to discuss the danger of white nationalist rhetoric in debates. The New York Times published a rush job editorial titled, "The Bullying of Ilhan Omar." In 2018, or even 2020, this strategy would have worked. The media would have circled the wagons, the narrative would have been set, and Bongino would have been branded a pariah. But this time, it failed. It failed spectacularly. Why? Because of the receipts. Every time a CNN anchor claimed Bongino attacked her faith, millions of users on X replied with the specific clip of Bongino citing her tax fraud. Every time an MSNBC pundit claimed he was being racist, users posted the video of him quoting her own words about 9/11. Every time the Times claimed she was bullied, the internet responded with the image of her refusing to answer if she married her brother. The narrative machine was broken by the sheer weight of the evidence Bongino had laid on the table. Then came the response from the squad. It was coordinated, frantic, and ultimately disastrous. At 11:47 p.m., Omar finally broke her silence. She posted a 23-tweet thread. It was heavy on buzzwords and light on answers. Tonight was a coordinated attack designed to silence a black Muslim woman. These are the tactics of fascism. We will not be silenced. Usually, a thread like this would generate hundreds of thousands of likes and supportive comments. But tonight, something unprecedented happened. She got ratioed. For every like, there were 10 replies demanding answers. Okay, but is he your brother? Why did you pay your husband $2.8 million? Why did you use air quotes for Al-Qaeda? Show us the birth certificate. Her own base was fracturing. The comments weren't just from MAGA accounts. They were from moderate Democrats, from independents, from people who had simply watched the debate and felt lied to. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tried to jump in, tweeting, "The attacks on Ilhan are disgusting. Dan Bongino is a conspiracy theorist." Result, ratioed. The top reply was a screenshot of the FEC filing showing the millions paid to Omar's husband. Rashida Tlaib tweeted, "They hate us because we speak the truth." Result, ratioed. The top reply was the video of Omar saying, "Some people did something." Ayanna Pressley tweeted about violence against women of color. Result, ratioed. The top reply was the photo of Colonel Calhoun, the amputee veteran, walking out of the hearing. It was a digital massacre. The squad, which had used social media as their sword for years, was suddenly dying by it. They had lost control of the narrative because they couldn't control the facts. And then, the final cultural nail in the coffin: Saturday Night Live. Usually a safe harbor for progressives, the writers at SNL saw the writing on the wall. They couldn't ignore the biggest story in America. 3 days later, the cold open featured a skit about the debate. It portrayed Bongino, played with intense, manic energy, pulling endless, comically large folders out of a tiny briefcase. But crucially, it portrayed Omar not as a victim, but as a dodging, weaving politician refusing to answer basic questions. When the Omar character in the sketch was asked about her marriage, she shouted, "This is racism!" The Bongino character replied, "It's a birth certificate, ma'am." The audience laughed. It wasn't a polite laugh. It was a laugh of recognition. When you lose SNL, you have lost the culture. The firewall had fallen. The protection of the media shield was gone. Ilhan Omar was standing naked in the public square, stripped of her usual defenses, and the entire country was staring at the emperor who had no clothes. The viral explosion of Part 9 was the storm. Part 10 was the reshaped landscape left in its wake. The consequences of the debate moved from the digital realm into the hard, cold reality of political power. In Washington, D.C., weakness is the scent of blood in the water, and Ilhan Omar was bleeding. The first domino to fall was the House Ethics Committee. For years, they had dragged their feet on complaints regarding Omar's campaign finances. They had accepted her amended tax returns without question. But the glare of 94 million views changes the calculus. 1 week after the debate, the committee announced a formal, expanded investigation into the allegations of campaign finance fraud and potential misuse of funds regarding the E Street Group. They subpoenaed the records Bongino had flashed on stage. They didn't do it because they wanted to. They did it because the public pressure was now a physical weight on the Capitol. The second domino was the Democratic Party leadership. Nancy Pelosi and Hakeem Jeffries were pragmatic operators. They knew the midterms were coming. They knew that the clip of Omar refusing to say she loved America was going to be running in attack ads in every swing district from Pennsylvania to Arizona. Omar was quietly summoned to a meeting. There were no press releases. When she emerged, the news leaked. She was being removed from the powerful Foreign Affairs Committee. The official reason was strategic realignment. The real reason was obvious. You cannot have a member who cannot distinguish between Western imperialism and terrorism sitting on the committee that oversees American foreign policy. She had become radioactive, but the most devastating blow came from her home district in Minnesota. The debate had shattered the illusion of her invincibility. For the first time, credible challengers stepped forward. The most dangerous was Amina, a Somali-American woman, a former U.S. Navy linguist who had served in Iraq. Amina launched her campaign with a video that referenced the debate directly. She stood in front of an American flag, holding her service medals. "I didn't flee a warlord to come here and attack the country that saved me," Amina said to the camera. "I came here to serve it. Ilhan Omar thinks America is the problem. I know America is the solution." The polling was catastrophic for Omar. Her approval rating in her own district dropped 23 points. Among independents, it cratered. She had lost the moral high ground in her own community. Omar retreated. She stopped doing national interviews. She locked her Twitter replies. The politician who had thrived on attention was now hiding from it. She was still in Congress, collecting a salary, but her power was gone. She was a ghost in the machine, present but irrelevant. Meanwhile, Dan Bongino had fundamentally changed the game for the American right. He became a folk hero, not just for what he did, but how he did it. The Bongino method became the new gold standard for conservative engagement. Republican candidates across the country threw away their consultants' advice to be nice or pivot to the economy. They started bringing binders. They started doing their own research. They stopped accepting the premise that citing facts was racist. The phrase, "bring the receipts," became the mantra of the midterm elections. Bongino's book shot back to #1 on the New York Times bestseller list, a spot it held for 8 weeks. His podcast became the most listened-to political show in the country. But in interviews, he refused to take a victory lap. 6 months later, he sat for a quiet interview, reflecting on the moment. "People think I enjoyed that," Bongino said, leaning forward, the intensity in his eyes undimmed. "I didn't. It gives me no pleasure to see a member of Congress humiliate herself. It gives me no pleasure to know that our system is so broken that someone like her could rise so high. But it had to be done." "We established a new rule that night," Bongino said. "The rule is simple. You don't get to hate the country and lead it at the same time." He picked up a copy of the Constitution from his desk. "This isn't a suicide pact," he said. "We don't have to give power to people who want to destroy us. We don't have to apologize for demanding loyalty from our leaders." The legacy of the debate wasn't just the political destruction of one congresswoman. It was the awakening of a sleeping giant. The millions of Americans who had felt silenced, who had been told that their patriotism was problematic, who had been afraid to speak up. They saw that the emperor had no clothes. They saw that the squad had no answers. They saw that when you stand up to a bully with the truth, the bully folds. The final image of the saga wasn't Omar fleeing the stage. It was the question that lingered in the American psyche, a question that would define the next generation of politics. And for the first time in a long time, America knew the answer.